Come back and give you part two of what is architecture. I forgot some stuff. Jenny has asked me to introduce Sam Jacob, which I'm happy to do. So Sam, as you know, is a clinical professor here at the school, has been for a few years, and for as long as he wants to stay with us this year. So we've been very pleased to have him here. Sam is a founding partner of FAT, which stands for Fashion Architecture Taste in London, a firm founded in 1995 with his partners Sean Griffiths and Charles Holland. They've been involved in many award-winning projects. The last Venice Biennale, the current Venice Biennale coming up, they are involved in the UK. Sam in particular is working on a project with Crimson and Oak Fleet in Holland and in Newtown. He is, beyond being an award-winning designer and one of the most precise and intense teachers both of design and writing and criticism that I've been seen practicing. Sam is also a major and important voice in criticism of the environment and design and architecture through his blog, Strange Harvest, but also through multiple magazine contributions as guest editor, contributing editor, and also the recent AD issue called Radical Postmodernism that he co-edited in really rethinking the possibilities of a certain forgotten and disdained moment. But Sam is a great relauncher, a reinventor of things that seem to have been obsolete and that we forgot what we might be able to make of them today. So always fun to listen to Sam, and so welcome Sam Jacob.
Thanks, Bob. That's a very, very flattering introduction. Very kind. It's a question. What is architecture? And I guess like a lot of you must be sitting there or sitting in a studio thinking, what is architecture? I remember being back in first year, and people would tell you, look at this guy, look all busy. This is architecture. Look at this is architecture. And I'm thinking, who is this guy? What's that project? How am I supposed to understand it? What's so good about it? Where is the good bit? What's the bad bit? It's very confusing. But the good news is it only gets worse. The more you learn, the worse it gets. And in a sense, I think my career, such as it is really about trying to figure out what architecture is. That's what I do. And luckily, I found ways to get people to pay me to think about it. I don't usually know that's what I'm thinking about. They usually think, like working out where the toilets are supposed to go or something useful, but actually, it's another project altogether. And as Bob said, I do a lot of different things. So I design things, buildings, which is the sort of traditional definition of what architecture is or what an architect does. But in a strange way, often actually doing that is the worst possible moment to think about architecture, because you actually just have to get everything done and make sure it works. You're constantly being hammered by the client, by the project manager, by the quantity surveyor, everyone telling you can't do that, you can't do that. It's a nightmare. It's the absolute worst place to ever think about architecture. But, of course, it is a component within architecture. So that's I think, part of the reason why I try to escape from that sort of tyranny into other areas, like like writing, like installations, like other kinds of projects. And in fact, that's really where I started. When I left school, it was the end of the last session, so the kind of idea of getting into an architecture office in traditional route kind of wasn't really viable. So me and a group of people started to do some projects which were, in a sense, about architecture. They weren't architecture used out in a traditional way. And this was one of the first projects, which was taking the advertising sites in bus shelters and essentially kind of block booking them and then offering up those sites to whoever wanted to take them, artists, photographers, designers, and so on. In a sense, a really simple idea, but what we thought we were doing, we were very pretentious and young at the time, was we thought we were making something which was entirely architectural, even though it didn't involve any of the things you normally do as an architect. It was engaging with the city, it was manufacturing a kind of art gallery, but it was doing it in a way which questioned a lot of the assumptions that you normally have about what an art gallery is. There's no gift shop, there's no walls, all of the things, the structures that galleries bring to the display of art are completely absent, completely dissolved. And instead, as a spectator, you're just waiting for a bus, confronted by an image in the place which advertising normally is. Except in this case, the image has no commercial content. I suppose the point of this is to begin to question, I suppose, what the limits of architecture is, what makes an art gallery, and what happens when you start to cross-fertilise between different kinds of programme. I suppose importantly, it was also a real thing, it really happened. So that was also, for us, very interesting. So essentially, very confusing images in the city. This was a second version of it where artists made installations around bus shelters themselves. But I think what it also revealed was something to us, was about the potential of what you can do in public space. There's the meaning of something like a bus shelter. When it gets a vernacular treatment like this, a thatched roof on top of it, suddenly that changes its meaning, changes the way that people relate to it, changes how it communicates. And communication, I think, was really key for us. In this sense, we were taking the sites of advertising, obviously a form of communication, and thinking of that in a way that performed in urban context, almost as architecture, which led us a few years later to make a sort of manifesto object, which is imaginatively titled Neon House, a house made out of neon. And what this was really saying was that you could think of architecture as a form of information, as a form of communication. So here, taking the materials of signage, things which normally flash and tell you commercial information, but here becomes architecture itself. And this was, I suppose, part of our rediscovery of postmodernism, a form of architecture which did recognise its semiological content, its communicational significance. And in this case, it was a sort of inversion of a house as a machine for living in. This was a house as information for living in. This is something we've very recently done, which is, I suppose, about the idea of architecture and a narrative. It's actually a doll's house, and it's a model of a brutalist building in London, Balfour Tower, by Goldfinger. So very, very famous, according to the general public, one of the ugliest buildings in London should be blown up. We thought it was the perfect thing to reinvent a doll's house. Doll's houses are usually kind of the most cute, the most kind of nostalgic, the most romantic, the kinds of things kids play with, like little cottages or castles or even spaceships. And here, we were taking something which, on the face of it, has none of those associations. But we're kind of saying, actually, it is all of those things. It is a little bit like a castle. It is a little bit like a spaceship. It is a little bit romantic in lots of ways, too. And what it does is cut these kind of more vernacular rooms into it, each of which is inhabited by a little character called Alan Measles. Alan Measles is the muse, the god of an artist called Grayson Perry. Alan was his teddy bear when he was about like 3, 4, 5. And for Grayson, he's assumed this godlike status and now instructs him on all the work that he does. So there's an element here of how architecture relates to narrative. Content, information, narrative. It's all about, I suppose, ways in which architecture tells stories and we inhabit architecture with stories themselves. So we make a lot of projects about architecture. I think all of these are things about architecture. This is another one for the Venice Biennale last year, based on Palladio's Villa Rotunda, which is kind of like the building out of which all architecture springs, or a kind of nexus within the world of architecture. Incredibly famous, incredibly innovative in its time, but at the same time completely derivative, like it's made out of so many references to classical architecture, assembled into something which becomes an icon of the Renaissance. And here it is. And here are other versions of it. Many has been copied so many times. This is one in London, which kind of kick-started the English Baroque. Here is Monticello. Here it is in Palestinian territories. And here it is on Google Warehouse. You download a million different versions, varying quality of the Villa Rotunda, which is exactly what we did. And we wanted to make a project which was about architecture's propensity to copy itself, to reproduce itself. And it was a project about making a copy. And it uses the technology of copying in molds and casts in order to manufacture a version of the Villa Rotunda. So you can see here the result. On the left-hand side is the mold, on the right-hand side is the cast that comes out of that mold. So on the one hand, it's a simple copy. On the other hand, it's kind of about positive and negative. It's about reproduction. It's about what happens when you pass an object through a whole series of different technologies. It's about the mechanism of copying, so the outside of the cast, the outside of the mold, the inside of the cast, all of the kind of accidental bits that happen within the process. So you can see the disgusting spray foam at the top of the picture, the negative of the exterior of the villa on the inside of the mold. So it's driven by kind of, I suppose, a way of asking what architecture is, or at a particular moment, a provisional definition of what architecture is, or within a circumstance of what architecture is. I think it's also something which is characterized our, let's say, built work. And it's strange to make that distinction between the stuff which is built and the stuff which is unbuilt, because it's really part of a continuum. And I've never argued that something which is built has more kind of status, more value as architecture. In fact, if you look around the city, it's obviously not the case at all. There's plenty more better ideas within the school here than there are necessarily out in the city operative right at the moment. So the projects as well also ask these same sorts of questions, or explore the same sorts of ideas. This is a very small building. It was our first building. It's a house with a little office attached to it. And this is a little accent project. What it really is a building which is a picture of what it is. So it's a building which is a picture of a tower block and a picture of a house and collaged together, like that. So it's incredibly direct. It's like a kind of much more simple than an advertisement, much more like a kind of thing you might do in kindergarten. You chop out a house shape from a piece of paper. But in its simplicity, I think, it wants to be kind of much more direct than architecture normally is. It doesn't want to be abstract. It wants to be kind of right up in your face, almost kind of simplified to the point where you go, oh my God, it's just a picture of a house. But from that point, it generates a whole range of different effects. So here you can see the facade of the building as thin as a piece of paper, almost, but totally unoccupied. But within the house, it becomes a much richer, more spatial experience. As you can see from the plan. So in the plan, it's like a kind of simple box with a thing inside it and a circulation of ramps around it. So in a way, as you walk through the house, you walk through the definition of the building, its image on the exterior, and then how it works, which is the kind of stuff within it. And then you walk through the gap in between. This being the gap in between, which is a sort of expression of what's buildable, and then what's architecture inside. So we've been interested for a long time in how architecture becomes narrative, how it takes on kind of forms and symbols and references and remakes them. Often we're looking for the most kind of obscure types of rents or the most difficult sorts of combinations. So this was a project in Holland for an art school which took kind of ruined Gothic architectural language, but cast it in concrete. So it has a kind of very weird combination of references, part brutalist, part romantic, things that shouldn't belong together. And sometimes that's like rhetorical. It's like us kind of doing it because we feel like it and we think it's right for a project. Sometimes it comes out of the story of the project itself. This is a housing project for a real group of people who've been working with the social housing, which is normally something which is like provided in Britain kind of by the state or nowadays by kind of quasi-state bodies. And it's usually something you get given if you're lucky enough to be given. In this case, it was much more like a commission. We were working with the people who were going to live in it. And the first thing we did was to go and look at how everybody lived. And we found this kind of stuff, which we thought was absolutely astounding. It's not architecture in the way that we would normally understand it. It's not something you find in a design magazine. But on the other hand, it's incredibly rich. It's incredibly expressive of identity, of desire, of ingenuity, and so on. Like, sometimes ridiculous, sure, but I think in that ridiculousness, it contains something which is really the essence of what architecture is about, which is how do we make the world that we live in. So our job, in a sense, was to try and process this kind of culture that we found in this community and turn it into something which was viable as a form of architecture. So this was the result of the project, which essentially takes lots of traditional references, very familiar to British housing, so the materials, brick, the pattern of the brick, the shapes which the facade takes up. But it puts them together in a way which is much more reminiscent of, let's say, William Burroughs, for example, like cutting up and slicing together in a kind of surreal manner. Oops. That's even better. Okay, so you get the idea. It's like very traditional references put together in a kind of avant-garde manner. So this is another version of housing which is
similar idea about how can you bring together like impossible things which don't put buildings not together and turn that into a housing block. Here it's Cape Cod houses, Scotland's off the apartments off, the Swiss chalet underneath. So there's something which talks about like ideas about housing as well as being housing itself. And then another project, which again is very much about narrative. It's about how architecture can tell a story, and how telling a story can sometimes be a really important social, even political function. This was a community centre, outskirts of Rotterdam, and a really rough place by Dutch standards. It's a very simple building, kind of industrial shed, but one which has been kind of cut and adjusted in order to make it incredibly specific to the place in which it is. So it's a building which talks about, well, I suppose you can see in the background, the chimney of a giant petrol oil refinery. So there's elements of that. There's the abundance of nature. There's words like elegant, which in Dutch means kind of loveliness. It sits in a park which itself becomes a narrative landscape. Full of objects and follies which are part of telling the story. This is the bridge into a children's playground. You can see the adult inside the door and the child inside the door. You can see the infilling the steel frame walking the door. Here you can see something which kind of rips on garden fence and highway signs as a wayfinding device which takes you towards the arboretum collection of trees run by the local community. And then just weird elements which talk about relationships of nature to industry, which is one of the things which characterizes this area. So absolutely revolting, chemical, pink couple of seeds cut into beautiful, romantic, natural logs. And you can see the building here. It becomes sort of abstracted cartoon which tells the story of the place. It talks about trees, houses, about industry, and it does it in a way which kind of is absorbed into the fabric of the building itself. And it does that because it wants to become a kind of civic icon. It wants to be something that belongs to that community. And in telling that story in a grand architectural way, it makes that significant, it makes it part of that place. So, that's really the kind of work that I'm often involved in. It's projects which have, they're building projects which have a kind of story to tell. It's something which is driven by its location, by its users, by its context. That becomes a thing which needs to be retold through architecture. And then through telling stories, architecture becomes engaged with its users, with its community, with the people paying for it. Yeah, that's a nice background. No, I think that's it anyway. And so yeah, I think really to sort of sum up, I think that's really the thing which has driven me certainly is really asking that question: what is architecture doing in any circumstance? And I think it's a very difficult question because it's something you think you know the answer to. So as soon as you look at the answer, it sort of dissolves, it becomes a kind of cloud. You lose the definition of what that thing you thought it was. It's almost like when you look at, there's certain kinds of stars, when you look at them head on, you can't see them. When you see it out of the corner of your eye, you can see it. And I think that's definitely the case with something like architecture, because in a strange way, architecture is everything. It's the entire world that we inhabit. That's what architecture makes. But when you break it down into the tasks of what an architect does, sometimes that feels like it's nothing to do with the bigger ideas of philosophy or society or high concepts, which actually architecture represents. So I think, in a sense, the sort of job of being an architect is often chasing that definition around through the stages of a project or through the kind of arc of a career. So I hope it's something which you guys think about now, and I hope it's something which you guys continue to be absolutely puzzled by. And I think it's perfectly acceptable, if not to be encouraged, to spend most of your time scratching your head saying, I haven't got a clue what architecture is. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions? Yeah.
When you were building the dollhouse, were you thinking of it as a model of a clear building, or thinking of it as a dollhouse-sized toy?
It was really nice to scale it down. Like it was partly to do with the fact that a building like that, it's a bit like the tower over there. You know? It's so massive and so heavy and so like architectural that as soon as you change the scale on it, it becomes this much cuter thing you can kind of play with and bigger than it and so on. It's a real transformation in itself. Just changing the size of something is really can be really like a radical change to the object. It's the same thing. So the funny thing is that it was auctioned last Monday, I think, and the night of the auction, it was bought by these developers who were on the very same night bidding on the real building. They came straight from that meeting to the auction, bought the little one. I don't know if they bought the big one. They got one. Yeah.
What would you say helps you the most when you're trying to draw out the narrative when you're designing?
Can you say that again? A little bit louder?
What would you say helps you the most when you're trying to draw out the narrative, or what is sort of your process behind that?
I think that's a good question. How do you know or how do you find something of interest? I think that's really the question. In this way of working, it's actually something which is both about digging around the project. Sometimes in very simple ways, just talking to people, just hanging out, reading a little bit about like history and whatever. And I think things like that often suggest attitudes or references which wouldn't normally be part of an architectural brief, which is usually driven, like I think, reasonably enough by certain kinds of practicalities of what they need to do. So I think that it's something which develops out of the circumstance. Often what's interesting, I think, is that it's something which doesn't come out of me, it doesn't come out of us. It's not like it's not like being a novelist in the sense that we imagine something and then bring it into the world. It's much more to do with a dialogue. And I suppose that's something to do with the nature of architecture itself, which is it is a kind of public thing. It's a public thing in how it's used, how it occupies space, how we occupy it. But it's also a public thing in terms of how it's actually produced, the process of making it. Like it involves so many people, from clients to consultants to contractors. And so the dialogues there, I think, can be really fascinating if you're open to them being absorbed into the project. I suppose what really drives it is how can you fold the story of the project back into a project? I think that's what our technique often is. That answers the question. Anyone else? Okay.
Why don't you ask about what do you think about meet somebody? get a real job. Well, why don't we get
Mario's got a question. He hasn't hand up.
I was just going to say, is it safe to assume that, so I know that we all don't know what architecture is right now, we're still discovering that. Is there a point that you reach that like folly, thinking that you understand what architecture is, and then suddenly understanding that you know nothing? Like what, do you ever reach a point where you think you know enough about architecture that like it starts expressing itself in your work?
I think that's, yeah, I think there's obviously things like technique, which, and skills, which are things which you develop. And they develop partly out of experience and partly out of the things which you're interested in. And I think that, on the one hand, is amazing. It's amazing to get better at something, and it's really good. I think it's also dangerous as well. You often see architects, but anybody who does anything creative, I suppose anybody who does anything, at a certain point, they just repeat themselves. They become so good at it, it becomes so easy that they can just do it again and again. And in a sense, part of the joy is not being good at it, but getting better or learning how to do something. And I think I've been quite fortunate in the types of projects that I've worked on. Have often been completely different, and technically leaving us scratching our heads thinking, how on earth are we going to do it? And then having to find ways to do it. And I think returning to that question, like what is architecture, is actually, I find it a lot more with writing, where you're often faced with more of a problem than you are with architecture. Architecture, when somebody asks you to do something, so even if you can't think of something, you can do some space planning, you can do all the kind of technical boring bits if you haven't got any kind of idea of where you're going to take the project. But if you're writing, it's much harder. You've got a kind of idea, you've got a column to fill, which is a thing which I most often face. And you're like, what on earth am I going to write about? How? Where do I start? And I think it's a really productive place to start. What is design? What is architecture? Or how is this thing architecture? This thing you're looking at. Like I think one of my favourite columns recently was for the zine, the hot dog stuck across pizza, and it's kind of looking at an object and being like, Jesus Christ, what a mess! Like, how do all these things end up like in one object? And like, why? And on the one hand, you're kind of looking at it going, this is a kind of wonder of the world. What kind of society can produce this jumbled, incoherent food stuff? And on the other hand, so that's like that's one point, like bamboozling the contemporary world as expressed through what design can produce. On the other hand, you think like, well, actually there must be something to this. Like, where did it come from? Like, why is it a form of design? How could it be a form of design? And so there's a sort of tension between, let's say, thinking of something as quite like fundamental or related back to kind of ideas that you might have learned, which are core to the discipline, definitions of design should be this, architecture should be that. And thinking about that in relation to a world which doesn't conform to any of those constraints at all. Like if you walked around like as guided by any architectural theory, you'd be lost in the world because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't describe the world that we live in. But it does describe something core to it. And I think the tension between those two things, like really fundamental question of what is design, existential horror of stuffed crust on top of pizza is a really interesting and productive place to be. I don't recommend eating it. I'd go for the Pizza Hut one, which has got like mini cheeseburgers on the crust, if you're really troubled by pizza.
It seems like the projects seem to have had a really definitive, seems like they had a really definitive response to what architecture was. We are constantly uncertain. But your project seems very certain. This is a house, this is what the house would look like. Is that paradox, is that the paradox that's supposed to exist, or do you see your work also as equally exploring the way?
I think it explores the idea, like, it often plays on with let's say, very recognizable elements, like things you think you know, like archetypal house shape, the villa rectangle, things which should have a fixed meaning. There shouldn't be any argument as to what a house is. We should all know what a house is. But, of course, we don't, I think. And so what they do is explore exactly that territory, the gap between the received idea and, I suppose, the nebulous cloud that surrounds it. So it's about both being incredibly explicit, but through that explicitness, kind of entering into the world which is much less fixed. Okay. Thank you all very much.